Today's episode is brought to you by MRC, a branding studio hailing out of Raleigh, North Carolina, where they focus on crafting killer design work for clients that love uber creative solutions for companies small and large. You can find and connect with them online at mrcraleigh.com. That's MRCRALEIGH, and at MRC Raleigh on Instagram. The good news is, if you find yourself reaching out, you'll most likely get to chat with yours truly. That's right, it's My Little Branding Co., and we're here to make your brand or idea look amazing. So let's connect.
Recorded at the Kitchen Studios. This is the Pencil Pushers Podcast.
Welcome, folks, to another fine episode of the Pencil Pushers Podcast. I'm your humble host, Mike Rosado, and we've got another gem today as we invite you into our chat with creative mastermind Lauren Hom. Lauren is a highly prolific illustrator, lettering artist, foodie, and more with a massive social media following that's hit meteoric heights through her persistence to pave new paths of creative expression beyond her lettering style, and in turn invited others to do the same. What I love about her story is that she works from her gut, never afraid to listen to her intuitive muse, even at the cost of potential quote-unquote failure. She pulls from the paths of the likes of Picasso, one who's never satisfied with status quo and not relying on style to define her as an artist in movement. And she works from a state of passion and curiosity that is refreshing in an era where it can be tough to pull away from what people know of your work. I found Lauren to be an absolute delight and a true dynamo who's in her element and full of pearls of wisdom. I highly recommend you slide on over to her Instagram at HomSweetHom, that's HomSweethom, to be a part of her community of creatives while you sit back, relax, and enjoy our chat with Lauren. All right, and we are here with another episode of the Pencil Pushers Podcast. Today, as our guest, is the uber talented and highly prolific hand lettering artist, foodie, graphic artist, teacher, author, and much more, Lauren Hom. How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Yeah, it's nice to have the day off today. It's a beautiful day outside in Raleigh, North Carolina, so I'm pretty lucky.
It is not a beautiful day here in Detroit,
really?
Michigan.
I was about to ask, so you are in Detroit. How long have you been living there?
I've been here for, 3.5 years, I want to say.
Okay.
Halloween 2017 is when we moved here.
Okay. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, before we dig in, I'm curious as to what was it that brought you to Detroit? There's obviously a rich history there, culturally, historically. What was your reason for coming to Detroit?
Yeah. People are always curious because I have no roots here. People assume I'm actually from the Midwest because I moved here. Long story short, I was in New York for 7 years. I went to school and then started my career there. And then I packed everything up in a backpack and went to do the, mid-20s, find yourself backpacking around Southeast Asia, Europe. And after about 18 months of that, I started to miss having a home base, and my partner and I were kind of just brainstorming, okay, if we're gonna move back to the States, we're both freelancers, entrepreneurs. We don't have to go back to New York. Where could we go? Maybe there's a new chapter we could start. And we basically just did a little bit of internet research and asked around our creative friends, like, where is a city that has a fantastic, accessible airport, a creative community, and a significantly lower cost of living than New York City?
Yes.
And a lot of cities check those boxes. And we narrowed it down to Austin, Detroit, and Nashville as the top 3 contenders to go visit and check out. So we went to each place for about 3 weeks to see what it was like there. And to be completely honest, the South is just too hot for me. I grew up in Southern California.
You're from Southern California now. That's kind of interesting.
Yes, I've lived all over. I keep joking that I just need to live in the South and like the desert in order to have lived in almost every section of the United States.
Nice.
Yeah, we ended up choosing Detroit because we liked it the best. I think it felt the most New York-ish, if that makes any sense. Like a really urban environment, brick buildings, concrete. And I think, we just kind of picked, and we were like, well, if we don't like it, we can always move. But We've been here for almost 4 years now. But Austin and Nashville, for anyone who's listening, great cities. Love those cities. Would love to go visit. We just happened to do our little test period in the summer. And summers in Texas and Tennessee are just something else.
Yeah.
And maybe in North Carolina, I actually used to spend every Thanksgiving in Greensboro with my best friend's family.
You did?
But I don't know anything about Raleigh or what it's like in North Carolina, not in the winter.
Yeah, it's funny. My brother and I just got back from a road trip across the country. We drove to to California, came down to Las Vegas, came back up. And it was funny, as soon as we hit Oklahoma City, which is dead center of the United States, my brother was like looking at his arms. He's like, I'm leaking. He had forgotten what it was like to have the humid weather, you know? So it definitely gets pretty steamy over here for sure, but it's beautiful. I love this town. I do miss the West. Visiting that area was just so gorgeous. And on that note, basically, the Pencil Pushers podcast carries, basically speaks towards anybody within the hand-drawn arts community. So we speak to people in animation, comic book art, hand lettering, graphic art, etc. And I want to do our listeners, honor them here and letting them not assuming that they already know who you are. You're obviously very, very popular and successful in your industry and your specific genre that you're in, which is, I shouldn't say specific because you're doing many things. But if we could, I'd love to sort of get to know you a little bit more. Even just personally, I'd like to get to know you a little bit more. So if we could start in Southern California, I'd love to know about what was it like growing up? What was your childhood like? And how did you start getting involved with, creativity, et cetera?
Yeah. First, I wanted to say you're not wrong to say genre or niche, or the creative community online is so massive and there's so many different pockets. Recently, I've just been thinking about what even is the creative community, lettering community, just because the internet gives us access to so many people. And yeah, I still mostly identify as a lettering artist. It's still my bread and butter, what I get hired for. I'm sure we'll dive into this throughout the podcast, but I've been trying to expand out of that over the last couple years, but it's still very much my heart and soul. So you're not wrong in saying that. So back to Southern California. Yeah, I grew up in Rancho Palos Verdes, California, I'm trying to think.
That's a little bit of a mouthful. What town? What was it called again?
Rancho Palos Verdes. It means, Palos Verdes means green sticks, so if that in Spanish. But it's a small beachy suburb, maybe 45 minutes south of downtown LA for anyone who knows Los Angeles. I used to tell people I was from LA just to make it easy, but then people would be like, but where? And it's technically not LA, it's LA County. But anyways, I grew up there. I had a creative mother and a maybe more practical father. And my parents were really good actually about nurturing my creativity, doing lots of crafts with me, letting me sign up for dance classes and letting me paint on my bedroom walls when I was younger. So I'm really grateful for that. But it wasn't until high school that I started considering I learned about what graphic designers do. And I was like, that's a job? That's amazing. Yeah. And I started kind of going down that route, taking more weekend art classes and just doing more personal projects. And my parents had some hesitation I think it came from a good place. They just wanted to make sure I could provide for myself when I grew up. And I tried to reassure them that there's art direction, there's creative direction, there's design. And so based on that experience, I somehow stumbled across advertising as a major. That was a thing you could do in college. And it seemed like this perfect intersection between satisfying the practical part of my parents and knowing that I would have job security and be able to make a good living and getting to be creative. And so that kind of led up to the path of me choosing advertising as a major going into college. The long story condensed.
Yeah. So basically, you were very interested in graphic design. So you were looking at, seeing that it was a very viable thing. You saw that there were, almost like, young heroes. I remember watching one of your presentations, calling out Jessica Hish and John Contino and stuff. So you knew about that before you got into college, is that right?
I didn't know about them in particular. I'm trying to think if I even knew any prolific graphic designers in high school. Going into school, probably not. I actually was just talking with a friend the other day. My gateway into commercial art, and maybe people will relate to this or maybe they won't, was searching for images on, do you remember that? I mean, they're still around, Threadless, the t-shirt company?
Yeah.
When I was maybe 13, 14, that was the pinnacle of that's so cool, I want to do that someday, because they were kind of emo stylized illustrations. And I was I was actually more into maybe fine artists at the time. I was a really big fan, and I'm still a big fan of Tara McPherson's work, if you know her work. She's a painter. She makes these kind of surrealist, feminine portraits. I'm going to do a terrible injustice trying to explain it verbally to your audience, so people can look up Tara McPherson if they want.
Sure.
But I didn't know about the graphic designers, like you mentioned, until I went to college, and that's maybe once I was immersed in school. I went to the School of Visual Arts. That's when I started, I feel like that was when design blog culture was really on the up and up, and that's when I started learning about these artists who were designers but kind of specialized in type. And that really sparked something in me for whatever reason. I just thought it was so cool that you could have a focus. And so that planted a seed in the back of my brain.
And also to be independent in doing so.
Yes, that was
Which is vastly different than the ad agency world.
Yes, and that was something, I think it was just kind of proof that here are these people who have made a name for themselves doing heavily typographic design work, and they run their own studios or they work for themselves. And going into school, I actually didn't know that was an option. No one had explained freelancing to me. Nobody in my family was an entrepreneur or did freelance. And so when I got to school, that's when I realized that was an option, and that definitely sparked something in me. However, I was on this path to go get a full-time ad agency job. And so I had all these what's the right word? I was kind of eyeing these other things that designers, 5-6 years ahead of me were doing while still staying the course that I said I was going to stay on.
You were getting these little messages happening. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's pretty interesting, because I know that once you got out of college, you immediately landed an agency gig that was fairly significant, right?
Yeah, absolutely. For all intents and purposes, I landed my dream job in advertising. My creative partner and I got hired right out of school to work at BBDO New York, which is a big firm, reputable. And it was basically what we had been working so hard for the last 4 years to do. And we were both super excited.
And you were working as a designer, by the way, at that time? You didn't have an art director position at that point, right?
We were considered, it's kind of a funny situation. We were considered junior art directors. So that was the track. So BBDO they did have in-house designers, and then they had creative teams who were working on briefs and coming up with ideas. And that was what we did, the latter, except for typically in an ad agency partnership, for anyone who is in the agency world or watches Mad Men, you'll know this. There's typically, you work in teams. There's a copywriter and an art director, and you brainstorm together, you create graphics and copy together, and it's just kind of that team dynamic. So we got hired together, but the School of Visual Arts is very visual, so neither of us specialized in copywriting, but because when they hired us, one of us had to be the copywriter. I volunteered because my partner, he grew up in Colombia, and his English is pretty perfect, but it's not his first language. And so we just, by default, I was just I'll be the copywriter, even though we both did art direction kind of things.
Sure. So once you got in there, I'm curious, because I know you mentioned in some of the interviews I've seen that it was pretty evident that that this was not really something that you wanted to do. And it seemed to me like it was deep in your soul that you were, that's kind of what I was gathering from what I was hearing from you. It was deep in your soul that I need to pump the brakes real hard on this and make a sharp turn in doing something a little bit different. Was it because I understand that the agency wasn't landing gigs, that you were, so it was like you were doing all this work and you weren't able to really see the fruits of your labor sort of like, out there in the world. Was it because of that, or was it just sort of the culture and the nature of the industry in general that pulled you away? Or was it the third thing, which is like, no, I just kind of feel like I know what I want to do now?
I think it was a combination of all three. I was definitely, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed going into the agency world, but I wasn't super naive. I knew it was going to be, work your way up. I kind of knew the progression I thought I knew the progression of what it would be like to kind of work my way up in the agency world. And going in, I was pretty committed to staying the course. There was a part of me that I had put 4 years into it, and it was something I figured I may as well try. And so I was excited going in, but like you mentioned, I did become a little bit disillusioned after 6 months, I'd say. It was the first time I ever verbalized to a friend, like, how's the job going? It's okay. And that's a really pivotal moment, I think, in any creative person or any person's journey, where you express to another human being, or even express or admit to yourself that this might not be what I want. And that sent me down a whole journey. I still stayed at the agency. I was able to talk myself back into staying, which, like, in any scenario, you can always find a reason to stay. And unless you actually, I don't want people to have to hit rock bottom, but it took things getting worse for me to be like, okay, I think I actually need to make a change. The agency pace was fine for a while. I mean, I was 23 at the time. I had more energy. I think I was willing to work the weekends and work the late nights.
And you were pulling a lot of hours, right? Like 60 hours a week for a junior. Yeah, it was knowing
that we were putting in paying our dues. I feel like that's kind of like industry jargon that gets thrown around in a lot of industries for junior employees. And I was committed to that until I wasn't. There was just something about, I think I had a realization early on. I was like, okay, I know it's a full-time job, cool, benefits, great. This is what I've been preparing for. My parents, there's security, they're happy. And then I realized, okay, 60 hours a week, I'm not making any extra money. And all this time, too, for context for your listeners, I had been dabbling in freelance on the side, and it was mostly freelance graphic design, illustration, a little bit of lettering. I started picking up freelance gigs while I was still in school off of Craigslist, because that was the only place I could think to go. I was doing, $50 posters and logos, and nothing that ever stayed in my portfolio for too long, but I did want to dip my toes in the water, even though I was a full-time ad major. And so I realized, I had this very practical moment where I realized, okay, I'm, working overtime, not getting paid more, and on the side, I was still picking up the occasional freelance gig, making $75 an hour from that at the time, and the math just didn't add up to me. The calculations going in my brain, I understood that freelance was unpredictable and there are trade-offs, but I just started feeling a tinge of resentment towards my job, and I knew at that point, I don't think, if I can't handle this for 9 months, how am I going to do it for 9 years, 20 years, 30 years? I know you can jump around to different agencies, but the last part that you mentioned of the culture, I think I had a realization that, I'm pretty sure that any agency I go to, this is going to happen to some extent. And maybe that's okay, but because I was young and maybe willing to take more risks, because I was so fresh in my career that it didn't feel like a huge loss to me, I had the realization that I'm 23. If I quit and try to freelance or do something else and it doesn't work out, I burn through more savings than I'm comfortable with, I can always go back and get an advertising job. Probably not the same one, because they're not going to rehire me after I quit.
Sure.
But I have my degree, I have my portfolio. What's the difference between getting a junior art direction or junior designer position at 24 versus 23? It seemed negligible to me. So all those things kind of coalesced in my mind and led to me saying, I'm young enough, or it feels it feels right to take a chance on myself, and if it doesn't work out, it's not the worst thing in the world.
Do you find now that now that you've been in the thick of it for a few years now, do you find that you could still have that mentality of like, oh, I could always go back to?
Like go back to advertising or lettering?
Or even, no, that's a whole other conversation. But no, going back to agency work or working for for somebody else, because that's huge. You know, I've had my business for 11 years. I started that out on my own, and it would be very difficult. A few years back when I was really struggling, I thought, well, I could always do that. Mm-hmm. But it's very hard for me to consider doing that now. Are you in that place mentally for yourself?
Pretty much. I totally feel you on early on, maybe in the first 3 to 5 years of running your business, when there is a dip or something doesn't go well, it is tempting to think like, because the grass is always greener, right? I could always get another agency job, like, oh, I could come home and just clock out and, maybe I'd have better work-life separation and boundaries. Right. It's definitely a trade-off. For me, at this point, I don't think I'd be very employable at a full-time shop, but maybe somebody would have me in the future. I haven't written it off completely. I understand that life is unpredictable. There could be a time and place in the future where that made sense, but because I've been doing freelance for 7 years full-time now, it's hard for me to think about going back to a full-time job. And in a way, when things get really busy in my freelance business, sometimes I even find myself thinking, I left the advertising agency world so I could work, so I didn't have to, work overtime, and I had more autonomy over my schedule. And sometimes when things are really busy and I'm working on an ad campaign but just doing the lettering for it, I'm just like,
Sure.
I'm still working in advertising, just in a different way. And that's okay, because I would still take the autonomy and, in my opinion, more equitable pay for the work over working full-time at this point. But who knows? I'm technically a full-time employee of my own company.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's different.
It's funny. It's funny because, even though you're still technically working in advertising, you're doing it on your own terms,
Yes.
which I think is the huge difference, right? I mean,
that is true. And to go back to that previous question you asked, one thing that I wouldn't have guessed would have bothered me, but really did, it ate away at my soul, was the fact that we'd be working on these campaigns, pitching ideas, pulling late nights, working the weekends, and then the campaign would be so easily shut down by the client, or they moved in another direction. And after 6 months, my partner and I went to go check in with our ECD and asked hey, we haven't shipped any real work in the last 6 months. Are we okay? Are we doing something wrong? We don't want to get fired. And he reassured us it's just the nature of the agency. You guys are doing fine. And something about that didn't even sit right with me, because I was like,
no.
There wasn't that completion, like you mentioned, the fruits of my labor. I don't know how excited I would have been to see a banner ad that I designed on a website. I don't really know how good that would have felt, but I think it would have felt better than it going in the trash or being
Sure.
completely sidelined. So the one thing about freelance that is an absolute win for me is there is more of a chance of the work going live. Most of the time the work goes live. Very few times have I worked on something, lettering, design in my own business where it hasn't shipped. But also that's why I work on my own personal projects so much on the side as well, because even though I am doing, living my dream, getting to work on lettering, getting paid for that, I still have a brief and I still have a deadline and I still have these constraints that most of the time are good, but sometimes projects, client feedback, after a couple revisions, it doesn't turn out the way you thought it would turn out, but the client's paying for it. So at the end of the day, I'm only going to push back so much.
Sure.
Passion projects are still my favorite because I get to be the creative director and the designer and kind of
And the client.
And see it through exactly how I would want to see it through. And I find that those personal projects often plant the seeds for getting hired for the most exciting, aligned client projects for me because they can see what I can do when there's no obstacles in the way. And sure, it has to, with a client project, it's going to be through the lens of that campaign or that brief. But I have found that I've been able to land more aligned work by just putting work out there that I've completed 100% myself. It helps nudge things in that direction.
Plus, I'm sure that if you, and I'm sure this is the case for a lot of artists who are doing it freelance or on their own, when you get hired for the work that you've created that is solely stuff that you've done, there's sort of a relaxation because you know that they're hiring you for you rather than trying to check a couple of different boxes where your style may fit in that category. Here, with those passion projects, they're pulling you in. They're like, I love what you're doing there. And it's something you're already excited about. And it's a part of your character, your nature, right? So it makes it, I would imagine for you that helps in that case.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that was one thing, I wasn't doing it consciously early on, but now I definitely do. I didn't realize that art directors and clients are looking for creatives to work on projects where they know the creative is interested in the topic. So for example, I do a lot of personal work around food and humor and relationships. And because of that, I tend to get hired for more food projects. And it might sound like stupidly simple, but of course there are assignments that come in where I'm not excited about the subject, and that's totally fine. I'm kind of a hired gun to come in and do the lettering, whatever the lettering is. But I find that clients are excited to work with me most excited to work with me when they know I'm stoked about the topic too. And clients can't know what you like unless you tell them. And I think a good way to tell them is through your personal work.
Great point. On that note, great segue for this other topic that I really wanted to talk to you about. One of the things that I really grabbed onto that you spoke about before was this idea of finding your voice, not your style. And when I think about your work and your trajectory and your what's the way to describe this? Your joie de vivre, your sense of exploration and adventure. You're not afraid to go in a lot of different directions. And it feels to me like when I hear this, find your voice, not your style, it is a lot about tapping into what really gets you excited from the inside, right? And I do think that's one of the things that I really identified with, because I do go in a lot of different directions that I'm very excited about. And I wanted to just kind of talk with you a little bit about this. Why do you find that finding your voice is more important than finding your style?
I think I've framed it up that way because I'm interested in a lot of different artistic styles. I didn't want to limit myself. It's so tough because it's like the business advice that you get is find your niche, be a specialist. Like that's the shortest, fastest path to being a successful freelancer, is being known for a certain skill or style. And I had known that. And I think what had happened for me was, and this might be a personality thing. So about 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years into doing lettering freelance, and I was getting hired to do this style that I kind of got stuck with, not in a bad way. I had started this Tumblr blog, which seems really dated because I don't think people use Tumblr as much anymore. I started a Tumblr blog in college called Daily Dishonesty, where I was hand lettering little white lies that my girlfriends and I would tell ourselves, I'll be there in 5 minutes, stuff like that. And I started doing those in this style that was hand done, but like scanned into Photoshop, and then I would add like a 3D kind of dimension to it, and it was in pastel colors. And that started circulating around the internet, and because it started circulating, that's what I kept getting hired for. And I was super excited to work on that at first. But like 2 years in, after doing most of my freelance work in that style, I started getting a little bored. And I started asking myself these questions of, ooh, like, do I have an issue of like not being able to hold my attention for that long? Like, I left my ad job, before a year was even up. Like, is this a me thing? And then I realized, like, no, okay, within lettering, if I don't want to just do this, colorful 3D digital style, there seems to be room to expand within lettering. Lettering is kind of the broad parent category of sign painting and chalk lettering and 3D lettering now. There's so many different things that I was like, okay, if I'm starting to feel like worried that I'm going to pigeonhole myself too early, even though the flip side is, yay, I'm booking a lot of work in this style, I was like, okay, it's up to me to start to nudge things in another direction to expand my portfolio without making a 180 pivot, because I feel like those feel a lot more precarious. I just wanted to, I've always described, the best description I have for my strategy in my career has been, I use personal work or passion projects as like the rudder of the ship of my career. And if I know I want to start exploring in another direction, I just do a couple pieces or projects that just kind of nudge me a little closer that way. It's not a drastic shift, but it happens slowly over time. And so knowing that, I started a project called We'll Letter for Lunch that was chalkboard lettering. And that helped build a chalkboard lettering portfolio for me, and I started getting hired for that in addition to the 3D stuff I was already doing. So the combination of those projects kind of set the stage for me realizing like, oh, I can make these small shifts, and even though the style of my lettering has changed, I guess in terms of medium and a little bit stylistically, because style is always evolving too. Because of that, I realized, okay, well, if I still need to find this niche and like have a focus in my business, I suppose that my voice could be the unifying thread within that. And when I say voice encompasses my personality, my interests, like things I'm just doing or thinking about outside of work. And of course, as humans, we contain multitudes, and I could be interested in 100 different things. But voice for me is, I've intentionally honed in on the couple subjects that I like to create artwork around. And that's worked pretty well because there's still that through line in my work.
It's like your language, your personal language, artistic language. Yeah. And it's interesting, I love this for multiple reasons, and I think a lot of people need to hear this because yourself, well, there's multiple things. One, you give yourself permission to be more experimental, and you know that it's coming more from, just your personality, your nature, you're right. And what it does is that it sort of trains your audience, your followers, the people that love what you do, to not be so specific on a style, but rather, no, I really like what she's producing as a creative. You were talking earlier about after 2 years, you start getting a little bored and you're wondering if maybe that's not the right thing to do. Is this, am I just being too all over the place? But the reality is, if you look at independent artists before graphic design sort of took this whole new trajectory, we're talking about artists who like Picasso, Salvador Dali. Picasso had his blue period that lasted 3 or 4 years. Then he moved on to something else, And so people were anticipating and excited for what the individual, what the artist was producing next, and was excited to see what different kinds of pathways they're going to take. So it actually gives you, in my opinion, it feels like it gives you more of an ability to be more expressive, have a longer career because you're not so locked down to one thing or another.
I think so too, and I think I've seen so many people do it so many different ways, and what you just said about Picasso, that really resonates with me and is more, I think, my style and what's going to help keep the longevity of my creative career going, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, just with internet culture and Instagram and social media. A lot of artists and designers, myself included, often struggle with, like, where do we draw the line between who I am as a person and my work? Because we're as freelancers, most creatives start out as freelancers if they're going to start a business. And as a freelancer, it's natural to build your business around you, because it's usually just you alone in your, alone in your apartment doing work in the corner. And because we present as people and businesses online, different strategies work for different people. Some people really like a separation between here's the work that I do and I'm going to keep my personal life and personality and this stuff like as separate as possible. For me, I think it is just going to be intertwined, because everything that I feel excited to share online, like I don't want to limit myself to a certain box. So for example, at the beginning of our conversation, when you mentioned like me as a lettering artist in the genre of like lettering, I went through maybe a 2-year period a couple years ago, this is fairly recent, where the advice of find your niche and had worked for me. I had found lettering, I was doing lettering. I started teaching workshops, lettering. And I found that if I can maybe illustrate this, like on one end, it's like, if you have no direction whatsoever, jack of all trades, it can be a little difficult for the customer to understand what you do. But when you find your niche and something that works for you and you stick with it for a long time, what happened to me was I built this weird, I don't know how to describe it. I started to feel trapped by, oh shoot, I found my niche, it's working, I'm making money, I'm getting to do lettering for a living. Am I allowed to do anything else because I found the niche? Is this it?
Yeah. Right.
If I start,
and you don't want to lose it. You don't want to lose what's giving you the popularity that you have, the success.
100%. And it's a weird. Maybe it's just me projecting onto my audience, but I genuinely felt like people only follow me for lettering. If I share anything else that's not lettering, it's going to completely tank and undermine the business that I've built. And it took me a while to get over that and realize that, like, no, people are interested in a lot of different things. And if anything, once I started sharing non-lettering things, I still do share lettering, but people messaged me really resonating with like, oh, thank goodness, like, I am so glad to see other people trying other stuff. Like, it gives them permission to be all over the place or try other stuff. It's a really tricky thing to balance creativity and business, as I'm sure you know. And there's different seasons of, heavier on the personal creativity, heavier on the business stuff, because different advice applies to different areas, but you have to make sure that you're nurturing both, because you got to eat. And I think you have to keep yourself excited about and in love with the work that you're doing, because I've realized for some reason, all the advice I've ever heard about like maintaining a long-term romantic relationship has proven to be true in my career so far. And I've only been at it for almost 8 years, but you do have to nurture it. It's not like once you find your passion, you're passionate about it the same way forever. It's going to change. And that's something that was news to me.
Yeah. And what I love about your story, again, just that your sort of courageousness, your ability to be like, I think that's one thing that I find pretty unique is how daring you are to go in different directions and giving yourself permission, and then also seeing how your followers are giving you that permission too. Do you find that as you become more daring, has this fed into your desire to share this with others through teaching now too, or no? Because that's a whole other avenue that you've got. I'm like, my gosh, she does everything. She literally, like, where does she, how many more Laurens are there, like, hanging out behind the walls? So anyway, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I started teaching not for any specific reason other than, like, I'm a natural open book, as maybe you can tell in this interview. I'm pretty comfortable sharing things and sharing secrets, if there are even secrets in the industry, because I didn't start out with the intention to do lettering as a career, and things just kind of happened the way they did. And when people would ask me about the same topic over and over and over again in an individual email or on Instagram, just for the sake of efficiency, I started answering those questions in blog posts or more public forums because I was like, ooh, if multiple people have this question, if I just write one thing that's public, then I don't have to answer all these individual
So now you just send
messages.
people links?
Yes. And so I started sending people links. And of course, if there's a specific question, I'll try to answer it. But at this point, my inbox is so overwhelming. If anyone has emailed me and I haven't emailed you back, don't take it personally. Because I used to take it personally when designers I would email wouldn't respond. I thought that I had done something wrong. But now I understand that they were just really busy.
Yeah. So I understand what necessitated you doing this, but you don't give me the impression that you would continue to do that if you didn't find some love, some enjoyment, right? So,
yes.
I mean, just so others know that may not know already, you started doing some classes through Skillshare. Mm-hmm. You've done your own personal online classes. You have a weekly creative challenge where you've got over 30,000 subscribers, maybe more. I don't know how updated that is, but clearly this is something that you really enjoy. Talk to me a little bit more about this. I mean, because again, it's so funny because I actually, in my notes, I do talk about, I have here that you are an open book. You do show people your process. You do show people various parts of your tips, stories, tricks, tools, all that stuff is right there for people to find out. Is this just a part of your nature too? You just love to share and inform people of kind of like where you're coming from?
I think it is just a part of my nature. And I also will say, I wouldn't have the career that I have now had other people who had come before me not been sharing things either. Like, I think I'm 30, and anyone who's my age or around my age in design, or especially in lettering, probably remembers how prolific Jessica Hish's The Dark Art of Pricing blog post was. And I was a student at the time when I read it, and it just blew my mind that someone would be that transparent about pricing out a client project and what that looks like. And I think giving people a peek behind the curtain is, because I get so excited when I get to peek behind other people's curtains and they allow us to do that. I try to do that as well. And I always tell people too, because things like time lapses and behind the scenes and process are so prevalent on social media, there are tons of benefits to doing it, but if there's something you don't want to share, you also don't have to share it too. I've met a lot of people who have different kind of approaches to how much they share online, how much they don't, how much someone needs to figure out the process themselves versus learning it from somebody else. I lean heavily into if people see my work and they want to know how it's done, maybe it's because none of my processes creatively are super complex. And part of me is like, well, if I figured it out, other people can figure it out too. I may as well save them the hassle and just show them how it's made. And I think
That's awesome.
it was just natural for me to do that. For all those reasons I just listed. And it's also, I do get a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that people are getting any wisdom or getting any help from the stuff that I share, because from the outside looking in, I know that the stereotypical thing is like, oh, it's so, like, it must be so nice getting to draw all day. Like, that's such a cute hobby. People think that because art is quote unquote fun, then it's easy. And anyone who's been working in the field knows that that's far from how it actually is.
It's brutally, it's a lot of hard work involved, obviously. I mean, we're preaching to the choir, obviously, for everybody who's listening, but yeah.
But there's so many, personal roadblocks, so many considerations. Creativity is just this kind of boundless thing. And so, reining it in or reeling it in is really tough. And the frustration of having no ideas and then so many ideas that you couldn't possibly execute them in a lifetime. Just the ebb and flow of creativity and trying to make a living from it is pretty intense. And so any way I can make it easier for people, the better. And then I will say this too, because I would be, what is the phrase? I'd be remiss if I left this out too. Once I started sharing stuff for free online, getting a great response from that, I started teaching in-person workshops, and those started selling out. And I was probably 26 at the time. I was living in New York, and so of course there's a huge creative community in New York, so maybe it's easier to fill up workshop slots there. But I was selling out, 15, 20, 25 person workshops and bringing home a decent amount of money at the time, maybe a couple $1,000 from a workshop. And I was like, oh, this is enjoyable and fun, and I get to interact with people, and I'm making just as much as I would a small, medium client project. And it added this diversity to my creative business where if I'm only working on client work, it can be very isolating just sitting in the corner of your room, pushing pixels. And it was nice, maybe you can tell I'm an extrovert, I love people and chatting, and it was really nice to not only have a part of my business where I could interact with people, but also that made money. So for example, I tried selling posters and posters, tote bags, just the typical designer things that you'd see in an online shop. And I was like, oh, this is hard. Fulfilling orders is hard and I'm not making any money. This sucks. And so I tabled that. I still tabled that. I do not have an online store because it was just something that didn't work for me at the time, maybe in the future. But teaching just checked those boxes. And I was like, okay, great. And then, like you mentioned, Skillshare contacted me. Actually, fun story for your audience. Skillshare contacted me to do a chalkboard lettering class because that project I mentioned earlier, Will Letter for Lunch, I was going around to restaurants in New York offering to do their special of the day sign, the little A-frame outside of the restaurant. And I was like, I will letter your special of the day sign in exchange for the special of the day. That was my little barter project. And it picked up, and I made these little flyers that I would go pass out. And it was, even as an extrovert, super nerve-wracking to pitch yourself as a cold pitch to somebody. And I happened to hand out a flyer at a weekend food festival, lots of little booths. I went around, I was like, oh great, there's 30 vendors in one space, I can hand out my flyers. And I happened to hand a flyer to this young looking guy working at this artisanal soup stand. Didn't think much of it. And it turned out that he was the founder of Skillshare, who just on the weekend ran a soup stand with a friend, I think. I have no idea. We never talked about it. But anyways, he passed my flyer to his team and they brought me in to do a chalk lettering class. And that was the first time I had ever taught online. And the response to it was really exciting to know that I could teach more people than could physically be in the room with me, and that the material translated in a video format, I didn't have to be there. And so that sparked something in me, and that led me to create my own online classes and kind of led to what I'm doing today. If that helps to give context for, it wasn't a brilliant business decision, it was just trial and error and opportunity as well. I learned a lot about producing online courses from that experience with Skillshare, because teaching online and making a curriculum is a lot different than teaching in person.
I bet. Well, you're doing it magnificently. I love what you're putting out there. I want to be very respectful of your time, but I have some key questions I want to ask about. So with regard to your freelance career, and we've talked quite a bit about a lot of the highs, but in terms of some of the tougher parts of being a freelance artist, I mean, how do you navigate being the main creator and the face of essentially your brand as projects continue to grow? Do you have assistants? Do you envision having future additional designers working with you, kind of like a Louise Feely type scenario, or turning it more into an agency? Or how? So firstly, how do you navigate that now, and how do you envision that in the future?
Ooh, loaded question. And it's funny you bring up Louise Feely, because I interned for her for a couple months in college.
Oh, you did?
My Gail Anderson was one of my graphic design teachers. I allowed myself to take one non-advertising class a semester, and I chose Gail's communication design class because I didn't have room in my schedule for a typography class and a design class, and because Gail's work is so type heavy, I was like, oh, I can get both in one class. Obviously, there's some common themes here of me trying to get the most juice out of the squeeze of a situation. But
another food reference.
Yes, I have considered that. I do have a full-time designer who works with me, actually. I hired her in 2019. Nice. I had an intern prior to that in 2015 to 16. So I had dabbled in the past with having some help. That was definitely a struggle because it feels your work and your processes are so precious to you that, like, how could anyone else come in and, if I don't do 100% of the work, is it really my work? Were some questions that came up for me. But after thinking about it for a while, I swallowed my pride and I was like, no, like, I can have people help. And honestly, another food analogy, the thing that helped me bridge that gap in my head, I think as artists, we get so stuck in our art bubble that we wonder, like, does this make me a fraud? Like, authenticity is so important, I think, with creatives. And when I started thinking outside of the creative industry or the art design world, I realized that plenty of other well-respected professions have assistants and have a team. And the thing that did it for me was, when you go to a restaurant and let's say it's Gordon Ramsay's restaurant, a famous chef or a well-known chef, they have a whole team working with them, helping them cook the food. Maybe they're not even in the kitchen that night, who knows? Or maybe they're just overseeing, but it's the vision and the brand that people come for. It's not necessarily, if Gordon Ramsay didn't if he didn't wash the dishes, it's not a Gordon Ramsay meal. I think that it's so silly in that context, and that helped me get over it and realize, like, hey, there's only a certain amount of work I can take on if it's just me, and maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm okay at capacity because I don't want to, the last thing I want is for me to have left my 60-hour-a-week full-time job only to get locked into working 60 hours a week on my own. And that's happened before. I've been there. Yeah. And it doesn't feel great. It feels just as bad as working 60 hours a week full-time, I would say. And so knowing that, I was like, okay, well, if I do want to either take some work off my plate or be able to take on more work, I need to get help. And so I hired Crystal, my designer, and she's been with me for 2 years now, and it's been great. And if anyone's considering hiring help or an intern or an assistant, if you can take anything away from this story, it's not that scary. As special as your process and your art is to you, believe me when I say you can teach it to somebody else and it's replicable. And I will say, everything just kind of fell into place. Me having taught workshops and classes prior to hiring someone made it a lot easier to train somebody.
Yeah. I think there's also a ton of value in having somebody who's very invested in the creative process, the projects you're working on too, who's also a creative to bounce ideas off of. I don't think that that's something that should be left out of the conversation. It's really, really awesome to have somebody there who sees the vision, understands it, and can kind of come up with even other solutions too that you may not have thought of and by yourself too. Let alone just the idea of having another person in a room, because it's such an isolating thing being an artist. A lot of times you're by yourself, and you as an extrovert, I'm sure you experience that quite a bit.
Oh yeah,
that's
absolutely.
That's awesome.
Because when your ideas are just in your head, they can just ping pong around in there, and it's sometimes here's a tip for people: if you don't have someone working with you or someone that you like to talk about ideas with, like maybe your friend group, you just don't really talk about creative ideas, journaling them out or writing them on paper is also a great way to get them out on your own, or even just recording a voice memo of you rambling. I find that verbalizing or getting the idea out of your head is helpful to work through it. It cannot just stay in your head. So not just pencil to paper. That's interesting. Pencil to paper works well for me, but sometimes if I don't want to write that much or I'm in a pinch, I'll just record a voice memo. Oh, wow. Wow, that's interesting. So getting back to the foodie component, as we get closer,
to the end here. I'm curious about, I did hear that obviously your love of food is gigantic, but I'm pretty sure I read that you're looking to become a chef. Am I wrong? Did I read that incorrectly? Can you clear the air for me?
100% correct. And it's so funny. I haven't done a lot of podcast interviews in the last 6 months, and all of a sudden I have a couple booked for this week, and I'm super excited to start talking about this publicly. Yes, at the end of 2020, I think 2020, obviously we were mostly inside, alone with our thoughts a lot of the time, and after the deep well of despair of the first half of the pandemic, I started to, get really introspective and think about maybe when faced with my own mortality or for whatever reason. My friends also told me about something called the 7-year itch, where in business, once you're doing something for 7 years, people start to want to do something else. I don't know why it's 7 years, but I started thinking about how much I like doing lettering and design, but how being in this world, I was like, it'd be nice to be able to explore. And I started thinking about, I've had conversations with friends, I'm not sure if you have too, about if you won the lottery, what would you do? Like if money was no issue?
Sure, yeah.
And my answer to that question has been the same for a long time. I'd host extravagant dinner parties. That's all I'd do for the rest of my life. And that's just, I love cooking for people. I think it's a way that you can care for people and show them that you love them. And it's a really nice, intimate experience. Also, food is the great equalizer in a way. Everyone has to eat, and so it may as well be delicious. And so when I took that into consideration, I had an epiphany, which in hindsight is pretty simple, but I was like, wait, I don't have to win the lottery to pursue food. I could just do it on my own if I really wanted to. And then all these questions came up of, am I abandoning a good thing while it's going on right now? Am I ungrateful? Like all these weird questions, like, am I allowed to do that? Do I have to start from scratch?
I have to ask you, what did your parents think of that?
Oh my gosh. So funny story. I called them and I told them the plan, and they were super supportive, and they were like, that's amazing.
They were.
Yeah, that's amazing. Go for it. Like, everything you do turns to gold, like really supportive. And I think it's because they saw the track record of when I first called them to tell them I was going to quit my ad job after 9 months, they were horrified.
Totally different story.
Yeah, totally different story. And to be completely honest, like, it wasn't until I started making good money from doing freelance work and teaching that my parents really came around to like, oh yeah, this is a career. And so they were really supportive. And then maybe a week or two later, my dad calls me with this laundry list prepared of reasons why I shouldn't do it.
Oh no, he had time to think about that.
He had time to let it simmer, and it came from a really good place. It was just, and I can understand, why would you stop doing something that's working business-wise right now? And I explained to him that...
Good question, yeah.
Yeah, I explained to him that it's not a complete shutdown of this business like we talked about earlier, because I've built my work, business, brand, all those things around, food and humor, and that's been a theme in my work. It's actually not a huge jump. People, even if they've only been following my work for a year, know that I like food and that I talk about food a lot. And so I told him that it really is just a new direction. And when I go to culinary school, the plan is to go in 2 years in 2023. I'm giving myself a healthy kind of exit ramp, I suppose, to prepare for that change. And what that means is just what I'll be doing is taking on significantly less client work. Hopefully, I'm not going to hold myself to it because it's very absolute, but I'm like, oh, maybe I'll take on no client work while I'm in school for a year. And that's probably not going to be the case. I'll take on like very select projects. But now that I have a full-time designer with me, it's easier for me to be able to handle any work that comes in. And yeah, I told my dad, I've got plenty of time to, grow a new business, or maybe I'll come back from culinary school and just stay the same course, and it was kind of like a creative sabbatical. I have no set business plan for what I'm going to do with this degree. I just kind of want to get back into that beginner headspace or being a student again. And my dad, when he called me the second time, he was like, why don't you just, cook at home for a year and document that? Like, couldn't you just do that?
Right.
And he's not wrong. I could, but I know myself well enough that if I said I was going to do it,
it wouldn't stop there. Yeah.
Oh, no, not at all.
It'd probably even like amp you up even more.
Yeah, it wouldn't happen. I need the separation. I need the container of, I've always joked that my career goal, which may seem frivolous to some, may seem unrealistic, but I'm going for it. My career goal is to be a perpetual art school student. And what I mean by that is I just want to work on creative projects and iterate and explore and always be in that state of exploration and kind of growth, free from the constraints of just client work, I suppose. Of course, there's a practical element. I'm going to do client work. I like doing client work for the most part, but I know it's up to me in order to stay, enchanted with or intrigued by my creative work. I have to be excited by it.